Welcome to the Hard Signal Podcast, a production of Next Gen Insight. And I'm Clayton Tidwell, its founder. My guest today spent almost 2 decades leading nonprofit food and nutrition programs in New York City before she did something most nonprofit executives ever do. She started a for-profit company built entirely on other companies' byproducts. Anna Hammond is the founder and CEO of Matriark Foods, a company that buys vegetable offcuts, rejects, and surplus that fresh cut processors and farmers can't sell. And she turns them into broths, sauces, and stews for schools, hospitals, food banks, and now whole food shelves. She launched her first pallet of product days before COVID shut down her entire target market. She kept the company alive through grants and a Kroger-backed accelerator, and she has spent the years since trying to prove that a business built on food waste can actually scale inside an industry that still runs on razor-thin margins and long entrenched supply chains. Welcome to Hard Signal, Anna. Tell us about your path to founding Matriarch. You spent almost 20 years running nonprofit food programs before you ever built a company. What finally pushed you to start one?
Well, my whole career really was in the nonprofit world, first the art world, then a little bit of politics, and then most recently built a healthy eating program for youth and families living in public housing. And while we were building that program, we were working with farmers in upstate New York to donate some of their extra produce into the classes because in public housing, very difficult to get fresh food in a regular way. And just learned, A, the challenges of logistics, B, something we all know, farmers need income. And our charitable feeding work in this country mostly relies on donations, which is not great for farmers. And then also simultaneously, all the information on the negative impact that food waste has on the environment was starting to really come into the public eye. And I just saw an opportunity to solve three issues simultaneously. One, divert waste from landfill and all of its negative impacts. Two, pay farmers. And three, create greater access to healthy food for more people that's also, economically equitable. And so that was really the motivation for starting the business.
So that pitch, Matriarch's pitch, sounds relatively simple. You take vegetable waste and you turn it into food, but the mechanics are real. There are real supply chain issues. You're sourcing off-spec produce from both massive fresh cut processors and small farmers, and all under the same USDA, FDA traceability rules as any other food product. Then turning it into 9 SKUs sold into 2 different channels: institutional service and retail. Walk us through what that actually means between fresh cut processor, throwing away carrot ends, and that ending up in a carton of your vegetable broth concentrate.
Yeah, well, setting up the supply chains really has been the core of the business in a lot of ways. I mean, you have to obviously make great products that people want, but our supply chain in terms of byproduct and surplus is very disaggregated in this country now. And so we just started off working with different fresh cut facilities that were interested, or we convinced to be interested in selling us their byproducts and putting in place all the systems they already had in place for traceability and all the food safety requirements that you mentioned. And it really was sort of facility by facility, bringing people along with this idea that not only educating them on the negative impact that food waste has, but the obvious impact on their business bottom line. If you're cutting the center of a head of celery and you're only using the center of that head for celery sticks in a plastic box in a grocery store, you're throwing out 2/3 of what you've already bought. And what you've already bought has been planted, used water, fertilizer, labor, it's used gas for transport. So you're really throwing a lot more than just what you've paid for it into the garbage. And this is at massive scale. So hundreds of thousands of pounds of byproducts are generated every day by pretty much every fresh cut facility in this country. And so we convinced people to try it, but also they saw a business opportunity in addition to a great story, in addition to if they're tracking, their food waste or any environmental impacts, to being able to solve to that. And then on the farmer side, because of the work I had previously done in public housing, we already had a lot of relationships with small and mid-scale farmers in the Hudson Valley. And so just talking to them about what we might be able to at any scale purchase from them that wasn't going to market, things that they'd already harvested but couldn't find a market for, or the market was flooded for some reason, et cetera. So we started sourcing that way as well. And over the last 7 years, this is our seventh year in business, we've just really built a very large replicable supply chain, sort of, place by place, but in aggregate, many millions of pounds of byproducts and surplus. So complicated to set up and definitely relationship intensive, which we
Mm,
always forget in this technological world that we
right.
live in, the importance of the human connection and sort of bringing people along to do something that they may not have done otherwise. But it also is a business model that just makes sense. No one wants to waste food. No one wants to throw money in the garbage. Everyone wants a good story to tell. And most people really do care about healthy food access for, their family, their grandparents, society at large. And so it wasn't a real big convince to get people to come along with us at the beginning. And then we just had some great successes very early on, and that grew and grew. And so now we have, as I said, a very large supply chain and manufacturing. And we actually have 4 channels of business. We sell ingredients that we use for our own products, but we sell those ingredients to other manufacturers who want the
Wow.
upcycled claim and who are interested in creating pantries or items that reduce waste across their portfolios, food service products, as you mentioned, retail, as you mentioned, but also we have a channel specifically for food banks, emergency food, and food as medicine programs.
So you've basically directly said here, and you've also said in previous interviews that people are incredibly willing to work with you. Has there ever been somebody that pushed back or just said no, it didn't make sense to them?
Yeah, and pushback is sort of it's a mix. I'm not sure if I would say pushback, but just maybe really wasn't ready and leadership hasn't been brought along fully to
Mm,
embrace the process. Because when you work with us, you do have to put in place all of the compliance that you have in place for everything else. But
right.
in
They
the
have to do things on their end before they can actually get it to you.
Yeah,
Right.
and we
Those
and we
cuttings
help with
just
that,
can't.
but it's not, you do have to bring your team along. You do have to put those things in place. And the first manufacturer that we worked with was a grocery delivery program in New York, and we did experiments with their byproducts, and we got really far along. And then right at the last minute, their legal team wanted us to sign a waiver, basically giving them sort of carte blanche. If anything happened, it would be our full liability, which never happens when you're buying a product from someone. Everyone carries insurance. And so at that moment, I mean, in some ways, I look back and I think, well, it was a shocker and it was a stopper of everything we were doing in the moment. But in the end, in a weird way, it was kind of great for the business because it was like, oh, we really need to expand this supply chain. We can never rely, I mean, the obvious things of any business, but when you're starting something, even more obvious that you really have to have a diversified supply chain and bring a lot of people into it just in the event that something happens or someone just decides, sorry, we're not going to sign those documents to you. So there was, pushback. Like I say, it's probably not the right word for that, but just
Mm.
maybe fear of,
Huh.
what this new space of upcycling could be. And that was also much earlier on. There was no upcycled foods certification at the time. It was still very new. And I think, all businesses are always worried about being sued for good reason and they have to be compliant. So that was the only pushback we had from the supply chain side.
If landfill tipping fees dramatically decreased or animal feed prices significantly moved up, would Matriarch be at risk from food processors still finding it worth the extra handling cost to sell to Matriarch versus instead of just dumping them or selling to the animal feed processors?
I mean, those fees would have to drop so radically, and I don't really see that happening, vis-a-vis tipping fees. You've got price of fuel, which is extremely volatile now and always somewhat volatile, and labor. So there's that. And animal feed, same thing. I mean, things still have to be transported by human beings, and that is mostly and that is mostly using fuel. So just those costs alone make that problem probably very unlikely. But more importantly, and I think that this is something just people have so much trouble visualizing, and probably because if you actually visualized it, you'd faint. There is so much waste in this
Yeah.
country, especially. And there's still, you could use all of what isn't usable for human consumption to animal feed. You could upcycle, all of it, and you could feed the country 1.5 times over with that food that's gone to waste. So, it would be amazing if we ran out. We would have solved the problem, but I think it's a very long time before that will occur.
Okay, fair enough. You've said in previous interviews that the biggest challenge in this business isn't sourcing or food safety, that it's distribution. Break down exactly what makes institutional distribution so hard to crack.
Yeah, I mean, this is just true for any food business. And I was recently in a program that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation hosted called the Big Food Redesign. And it was, all companies that applied and got into it were, doing different things in the food system: circularity, regenerative agriculture, new grains grown in Africa, upcycling, et cetera. And there was one session where everyone was, sort of a group session, and the EMF was asking, what are your biggest challenges? And basically everyone was talking about marketing and distribution. And those are the things that are the hardest about food, bringing any new food product to market to begin with. And when different markets have different challenges. So, retail, the market is, pretty much owned by a certain number of grocery stores, and that's a set
Hmm.
number in the country, and they use certain distributors unless you're lucky enough to work regionally and you can work with local distributors. There are enormous costs involved with that, shelf free fills, all the things in retail that we all know about. Food service, different thing. You have to work with certain distributors in order for the large food service operators to even be able to get your product. So, it's like a little bit of a chicken and an egg also is, you need to get the account before you get the distribution. But in order to get the account, you have to have the distribution. And we've sort of, I like to call us like minnow sharks, where we just sort of find our way into the little cracks, and we take a bite out and we open the door a little bit more. And so over the last 6 years, we've had the privilege of being in a number of accelerator programs, some specific to upcycling, some for women owned businesses, some for, food system circularity solutions. And every one of those programs has opened a couple of doors for us. And so that's really, helped us to get in at the ground level into a very complex web of distribution and sales. And still, you have to have money to make money. And we're all fighting, big food, food writ
Yeah.
large, or even people's notions of like what food system change is. And I think our goal, along with all of the other people, who are, competitive colleagues, I guess I would call, who are bringing new products to market and developing new supply chains, really are sort of fighting against a system that's, owned by very large corporations, and who really kind of have almost a death grip on distribution and sales. But, we're getting there. And every year we get there a little further, and people sort of think more about, what is in my pantry? What are the ingredients that I'm using in food service? What impacts do those have on the larger food system? What is the flavor we can sort of add in using products that don't have additives against products that have been designed, with additives and all kinds of chemicals to like light up your taste buds. So, there are little battles everywhere that sort of aggregate into a larger big battle, but I don't know, we just fight them one at a time and win one at a time, and eventually we'll get there.
Speaking of the large players and distribution, how much of your current volume runs through Sysco and US Foods versus perhaps a few direct accounts? And what happens to your margin
I mean,
once a new
90, I
distributor
would
is in the
say
mix?
90% of our products run through Sysco and US Foods because, because we're heavily in food service.
Well,
And
that's about their market share, isn't it? Around
yeah, I mean, that
88
is,
or
and
89%.
that is the, the national account. We use a local distributor for our retail products, and for the ingredients we ship direct. So, we have kind of like B2B, B2C business, and, and they're all different, and our margins are different for every channel of our business. But, all of that distribution definitely eats into a margin. So you have to be really careful. And I always say when people starting new businesses come to me for any advice, what's the most important advice? And I always say, if you don't have a 50% margin when you start out, when you launch your product, you're not going to
Oof.
make it because
Yeah.
that margin's just going to get eaten by every little thing you can imagine. And
Yeah.
that was the advice I was given by one of our mentors, and it's completely uh, stayed true. And we have religiously ensured that when we launch a product, we start with a 50% margin.
At a minimum, right?
Yeah, at a minimum. Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. 8 years in, food service
Seven,
was at
seven,
least
seven.
7 years in. Sorry, yeah, yeah, 7, just
This
before
is our
COVID, right?
seventh year. Don't age me more.
Right, okay, yeah.
Don't
7
age
years
me
in.
more than the business already
Oh,
has.
7 years in or nearly, you're in your 7th year in. And food service was, like, originally supposed to be the core of this business. Is it still, or is retail quietly becoming the real growth engine while food service still stays a mainstay mission story?
Yeah, I mean, each channel has its own value. Ingredients and food service and emergency food actually are the financial drivers for the business. Retail is, very expensive, as your audience knows, marketing, slotting fees, all of the, the nickeling, diming of every little
Mhm.
piece of it. But we do well in retail, and the brand, people love the brand and really trust it. And it's been a wonderful way to, educate our consumer about, what is upcycling? How can you contribute to a positive environment by everyday food items? So, it's each channel has its own value.
You mentioned earlier some accelerator programs and some things that kind of, help push you along over these almost 7 years. You've raised under $1.5 million, including about a quarter million as a direct impact investment from Kroger's Zero Hunger, Zero Waste Foundation, while selling now into Whole Foods and national food service distributors. How does that math work? What got you over the hump, or what particularly was so foundationally important about that or another
I mean,
impactful
from a
program for you?
financial perspective,
Hmm.
I mean, we've really raised very little money for an emerging company. We did,
Yeah, under 1.5 million in 7 years. So yes, that it is small, but
and we
it
reached
must have been
profitability
quite
last year.
impactful.
So, I think, it's a couple of things. I mean, my business partner is a former banker, and we live in our numbers. And that has been, I mean, we worked now together for 15 years. She was the CFO at the nonprofit I used to run. And so that's, whenever people ask me about like finding a co-founder or what's the most important person, is just like make sure your numbers that, make sure you know everything about what you're spending down to the Kleenex you use. And I think that our
I'd love
that
to see your spreadsheets.
yeah, I mean, that nonprofit training makes you really rigorous financially in a
Mm,
way, we don't, we're a no waste company, and we're a no waste business financially. And then the equity free money that we got from the Kroger program and a couple of other grants that we had really allowed for a kind of creativity that I think we would have felt more anxious about, had that been investor money. And not that we, spent it any less rigorously or thoughtfully, but it had a different feeling to it. And so it allowed for, as I said, this kind of creativity to build the future we were trying to imagine, essentially. And so, I think that combination of financial rigor and creativity, and also wanting to build a real business, and a business isn't a business unless you're making money. And a
yep.
impact company is not an impact company unless you're selling the products that make the impact. So I think that those combinations of things really have led to where we are now.
You mentioned your partner, also another woman. Does being a certified woman-owned and being mission-driven, do you think that opens doors with impact capital that otherwise might be closed to you if it was just numbers alone that were being presented?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we called the company Matriarch for a reason. We need more
It's a good
women
name.
in business out there, with a different perspective on the world. And I also am, a mother to three sons and a grandmother to four. So I think that the matriarch metaphor lives deep in the business.
Mm. Hmm.
But also, there have been programs specifically for minority and women-owned businesses that we've been able to participate in that have just broken barriers that would have been really challenging otherwise. And, I know we're living, in an era of, a very anti-diversity era
Yep.
in this country now. But, the society is made up of a lot of different people with very different backgrounds and very different very different abilities to access capital. It has nothing to do with anyone's work ethic. It really does have
Yep.
to do with, networks and opportunities. And so those programs are, self-selecting for people who are interested in supporting an equitable system across business. And an equitable system across business brings better competition. It brings a greater diversity of products and thinking and everything else. So that definitely has been helpful to us. And I'm a big proponent of, supporting underrepresented business owners in different kinds of programs for that reason.
Here, here, me too. The upcycled food movement that you helped found, it's grown fast. The Upcycled Food Association now counts 250 plus member companies versus about 8 at the start, if my research is right. But 2026 and really beginning in 2025 has brought real headwinds to the institutional food security world that Matriarch and its customers depend on. Federal cuts to food safety infrastructure, USAID's dismantling, and pressure on programs like SNAP and WIC that touch the same food banks and institutions that Matriarch sells into. That has undoubtedly put food service and food bank customers that depend on public funding under real pressure right now. How exposed is Matriarch to these cuts in federal food security spending?
I mean, we're all exposed, in different ways vis-a-vis these cuts. For us specifically in our business, I mean, we had a big purchase order that we were supposed to deliver on January of 2025, and it was a USDA funded program. And that program disappeared overnight, and we lost $1 million purchase order. So the beginning of the year started out pretty like with a big slap in the face and also, just a slap in the heart, I would
Yeah.
say. It certainly slowed things down in a certain way from a financial perspective, like at the beginning of last year, and then we sort of revved up another channel of the business and put more attention there to generate revenue where we knew we could get it. I mean, the things you always do in an emerging company. I mean, we're not exactly a startup anymore, but we're still pretty early on in the journey. I think that it's also one of the things I think is very interesting about what's happening now is that the people who were just telling a story about sustainability or doing a podcast about, something like a pilot that they did one time, but not really bought into systems change, that business has just fallen away. And the people who are really serious about it are totally doubling down. And
Mm.
so I mean, I am definitely an always look on the bright side kind of person. So there's that, but I do see a deepening seriousness about procurement, about what needs to be done, about companies that have just decided like we believe and we are going to die on the sword of this belief and we're going to only procure from the companies that are doing the right thing. And I think that that's really interesting and it keeps me hopeful actually about the direction that the space is going in. We recently were invited into a program in Boston called Yes Boston, which is supported by Deloitte and World Economic Forum and Mass Challenge, among others. And they chose 12 companies doing work in food systems renovation. And when I looked around the room and I saw those companies, and there's one that does refrigeration and one that does meal planning for people with diabetes. And, there's us that's doing upcycling and waste reduction and, healthier food. And then some delivery programs for food as medicine and another company that's, doing bio. I can't even explain it because I don't know the science, but basically like using biology to turn waste into different kinds of products. And it was amazing to be in that room with those companies because I was like, these are at scale, these are the solutions. So if
Yeah.
this cohort of businesses scales over the next 4 to 8 to 12 months, there's an ecosystem of solution here. And I think that that is becoming more and more true. I mean, we were on a business call with a partner in DC yesterday, 4P Foods, and they were telling me about a consortium of food hubs on the Northeast, seaboard that's working on collaborating between the hubs for sourcing regionally. I didn't even know it, even though we're working with a bunch of them. But that kind of thing is amazing. And 4 or 5 years ago, things were happening, but they're happening more quickly. There's more collaboration. People are really kind of leaning into change in a way that I find incredibly exciting and hopeful.
Are you seeing institutional funding and backing for these mission-driven companies that are trying to solve these issues? Or
Institutional funding really right now is really, first of all, it's not my space. So I can't say I could speak to it with
okay,
authority. So, what I'm saying is an impression. And my impression is that so much money, venture capital got spent on alternative meats and none of that got a return. And so it
yeah,
sucked investment away from, a lot of other innovation that's sort of coming to the fore now. So I see investment happening, but also, it's a challenging time. People are being really careful. They don't know, what's next. So more careful with things that are new and kind of getting a little more traditional, I suppose, in their investing or just hanging on to cash and letting it grow in the bank or whatever it does. But what I see is the companies are finding the right investors, the right partners who really can not only bring cash to the table, but expertise and other business
mm,
relationships. And that certainly makes things potentially move more slowly, but I think it may make things more solid in the end because people are building businesses brick by brick by brick in almost the old fashioned way. Now that's not true at all for the sciences or, biotech. And again, like that's not an area I can speak to. So I don't
sure.
know what's happening there, but certainly in our space, that seems to be what's happening.
What's the hardest lesson you've learned running this operation that you wish someone had told you earlier?
I get asked that question. I'm just going to say the same thing I always say. And the same thing is that I wish that it's two answers. It's like, on the one hand, I wish someone had told me. And if they'd told me, I probably wouldn't have listened. And if I'd listened, it might have been actually bad for the business. But,
Oh,
being more patient
mm,
for change and, sort of like things like take a long time and you have to like, work around the edges and da da da. So, I think that maybe would have been helpful on the one hand. And on the other hand, being a bull in a china shop sometimes is a good thing. And sometimes you really have to, just forge ahead and not worry too much about every little nicety. I'm not sure that's said in the right way, but because I'm certainly not rude, but it's like if someone is, if something is frustrating and people are just sort of digging their heels in for no reason, it's really hard for me to, be patient with that. Let's just say.
probably a little bit of your native New Yorker comes out, right?
Yeah. And also, there are millions of people hungry on this earth. And, whether you believe in climate change or not, the climate is changing. It doesn't matter if you think it's from human cause or not. Any
Right.
farmer, regardless of their political beliefs, knows that the environment is changing and they need to adapt to it. And so
Yep.
any solution to become adaptive is necessary. So I also, I have no patience with that kind of like, do you believe it? Do you believe? I don't even care if you believe in it. There's a fact of change
Yep.
that's happening, and we need to become adaptive in a collaborative ways to, to feed the world, to feed ourselves, to, keep our cities thriving. And so, that's again where my impatience is just like, okay, people, like we could talk about this for another 5 years. And meanwhile, like rice farmers in Georgia can't flood their fields, so
Yep.
let's get on the horse and go.
So we started something new in the previous podcast, and it was well received. We started a little lightning round to end the podcast. So one word for the state of America's food waste problem right now.
Fixable.
Okay. The one big food company you'd most want to see get serious about upcycling.
Campbell's.
Nice. Vegetable broth or tomato sauce? Which matriarch product are you the proudest of?
That's like choosing between children.
I
I can't
knew
do
you were going to
that.
say that. I knew you were going to say that. All right. Well, Hannah, it's been a real pleasure having you on the Heart Signal podcast today. I want to thank you so much for your time and tell our audience where they can find you and find your products if they haven't already guessed.
Yeah, well, if you're a manufacturer and you want upcycled products in your products, then reach out to our wholesale address on our website. If you're a food service company, you can find our products on Sysco, Foodbuy, Vizient, or again through our website, retail, Whole Foods, and Fresh Direct in the Northeast. And shortly we'll be in Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Vermont, and also online. And then for emergency food and food banks through our website, through Sysco, through all of our distributors.
Got to get you down into Texas with Central Market and HEB.
Yeah, no, we are very eager to get into Texas. So if anyone on this podcast, I mean, is listening to this podcast and wants to bring us to Texas, we'd be thrilled.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again so much for your time, and hope you have a wonderful and happy 4th of July weekend.
You too. Thanks. Great interview.
All right. Thank you.